I am 51 years old, and I want to tell you about something that has been happening in the alley behind my store for the past 3 years, and that I have not discussed with anyone in Morgantown because my business depends on people trusting that I am a reasonable and reliable person. And reasonable, reliable people do not tell their customers what I am about to tell you. The store building is on a block of older commercial buildings, and behind the block runs a service alley that the businesses on the block use for deliveries and dumpsters and the occasional employee parking. I use the alley several times a day for deliveries, and I know it well. It is a normal service alley in a normal West Virginia college town, and for the first 16 years I ran the store, it gave me no reason to think about it. 3 years ago in late October, I was in the alley at close, around 7 in the evening, checking that a delivery door was locked properly. It was dark by that hour, and the alley has some overhead lighting, but not a lot. Pools of light with gaps of shadow between them. I was at the delivery door, which is about halfway down the alley behind my building, when I heard something at the far end of the alley, the south end, where the alley opens to a side street. I looked at the south end of the alley, and there was a shape there at the opening, large, and it was in the gap between two of the overhead lights, so I could not see it clearly. What I could see was that it was tall, and that it was in the opening of the alley, and that it was facing into the alley, facing toward me. I stood at the delivery door and I looked at the shape at the south end of the alley, and the shape did not move, and it did not make a sound, and I could not resolve it into anything I had a confident name for. The height of it was the first wrong thing. Too tall for a person at that end of the alley. The second wrong thing was the stillness. The absolute stillness of something that is watching rather than passing through. I went inside through the delivery door and I locked it behind me. The following week I was closing again and I went to the delivery door again and I did not go into the alley. I looked out the small window in the delivery door and the alley was empty and lit by its inadequate overhead lights, and I locked the delivery door from inside and went out the front. For the past 3 years, I have not gone into the alley after dark. I rearranged my delivery schedule so that all deliveries come in the daylight hours. I park on the street in front of the store rather than in the alley. I do not go into that alley after the light goes. 3 months after the first occasion, I was working late in the store, well after close, doing inventory, and I heard something in the alley from inside the building. Not a distinct identifiable sound. A quality of the alley that was different through the back wall of the building at 11 at night than it usually was. A sense of the alley being occupied that communicated itself through the wall in a way I cannot make more precise than that. I have felt this on 8 or 9 occasions over 3 years, and every time it resolves the same way, with me staying inside and the alley eventually going back to its normal empty quality, and me going home without going into the alley. Last spring I was in the alley in daylight when a woman who works at the restaurant 2 buildings down came out of her building's back door, and I asked her, in what I hoped was a casual way, whether she or anyone in the restaurant had had any experiences in the alley at night that they found unusual. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said that the kitchen staff had a standing policy of not taking trash to the dumpster after 9 at night, and that the policy had been in place since well before she started working there, and that nobody had told her specifically why, but that everyone understood why. I thanked her and went back inside, and that conversation confirmed what I had suspected, which is that I am not the only business on this block that has made accommodations for whatever uses this alley at night. The policy exists. It has been in place for a while. Nobody talks about it specifically, but everyone on the block understands it. I've kept the store for 19 years. I'm going to keep it for many more. The alley behind it belongs to something at night, and I have made my peace with that, the way you make peace with any condition of a property that you cannot change and would not benefit from fighting. You work around it. You adjust your schedule. You do not go into the alley after dark. It is a small accommodation, and I make it without regret. Story 2. I grow most of what my family eats. Have for 20 years since my husband and I moved to the property in McDowell County, where we still live. outside of Welch. We have a large kitchen garden, a root cellar, a smokehouse, and I put up somewhere between 400 and 500 jars of preserved food every year. Tomatoes, beans, corn, pickles, jams, apple butter, whatever the season produces. The canning takes up a significant portion of my time from June through October, and it is work I love. My name is Naomi Stratton, and I am 46 years old, and I want to tell you about something that happened in my root cellar in October of 2 years ago that I've thought about every day since, and that I have not told my husband, because my husband is a practical man who does not need additional concerns, and because there's nothing he could do with the information that would improve our situation. The root cellar's dug into the hillside behind the house, accessed by a wooden door set into the hillside about 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, with shelving on 3 sides and a dirt floor. It is cool and dark, and it smells like earth and preserved food, and it is one of my favorite places on the property. I am in it several times a week. In October of 2 years ago, I was in the root cellar in the early afternoon doing an inventory of what we had put up, counting jars and noting what we needed more of before the season ended. I had the door open behind me because the afternoon light was good, and it helped me see the labels on the jars on the deeper shelves. I was on the far wall when I heard something on the hillside above the root cellar. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the slope directly above where I was standing, which put the footsteps directly above the earthen roof of the cellar. My first thought was deer. We have deer on the property constantly, and they walk the hillside above the cellar regularly, but the pace was wrong for deer and the weight of each step was wrong. Deer move lightly and quickly. What was walking above the cellar moved with a weight and a deliberateness that was different. Each step was distinct and heavy, and the pace was slow, measured. I stood still in the root cellar, and I listened to whatever was walking above me on the hillside. It walked slowly from east to west, above the cellar, reached the west edge of the cellar above me and stopped, and then it walked back, east, above me, step by measured step, pacing. Whatever was on the hillside above my root cellar was pacing back and forth above it, 12 feet east and 12 feet west and back again. I stood in the cellar and I counted the passes. 4 complete passes east to west and back. Then it stopped. I stood still for another few minutes after it stopped. The hillside was quiet. I went to the cellar door and I looked up the hillside. There was nothing visible on the slope. The leaves were down. It was October, and the visibility through the bare trees was good. Nothing on the hillside. I came back inside the house and I stood at the kitchen window looking at the hillside for a while. Nothing. The following week I was in the root cellar again and I did not hear anything from the hillside. I have been in the root cellar hundreds of times in the 2 years since and I have not heard it again. What I have noticed, and this is the part that I have had the most difficulty with, is that on 2 occasions in the past 2 years, I have found jars in the root cellar that have been moved, not dropped, not disturbed in any damaging way, moved. Specific jars taken from their places on the shelves and set on the dirt floor of the cellar, upright in the center of the floor. Once it was 3 jars of tomatoes. Once it was 2 jars of apple butter. The jars were on the floor when I went into the cellar in the morning, and I had not put them there. I replaced the jars on their shelves both times and said nothing to my husband. I do not know what it means. I do not know if the pacing on the hillside and the moved jars are related or are separate things. I know that whatever paced above my root cellar did so with knowledge of the dimensions of the space below, because each pass was precisely the width of the cellar and turned at precisely the eastern and western edges of the roof. It knew what was below the ground it was walking on. Whether it has been inside the cellar since and moved those jars, or whether the jars moved through some other means I cannot account for, I do not know. What I know is that the root cellar is part of my life and my family's food supply, and I'm not going to stop using it. I'm going to keep putting up 450 jars a year, and I'm going to keep doing my inventory. And I'm going to note when jars are moved and replace them and carry on. Some things you cannot fight and do not need to fight. You just need to know they are there and act accordingly. I know it is there and I act accordingly. That is the complete response I have available to me, and I have decided it is sufficient. Story 3. I taught mathematics at the high school in Philippi, Barber County, for 31 years before I retired 6 years ago. I want to say something about what 31 years of teaching mathematics does to you, which is that it gives you an absolute intolerance for imprecision. Mathematics is either correct or it is not, and there is no productive middle ground, and this orientation carries over into everything else. When I tell you something happened, I mean it happened specifically, and I mean I observed it with appropriate care, and I am not embellishing. My name is Clarence Moody, and I am 64 years old. I live in Philippi in the house I have lived in for 30 years, a 2-story house on a residential street 4 blocks from the high school where I taught. I know this neighborhood with the precision that 30 years of daily observation produces. I know what it looks like in every season at every hour. What I want to tell you about happened on my own front porch on a night in March 3 years ago. I was sitting on the porch at about 9 in the evening, which I do in every season when the weather permits, reading. March in Barber County can go either way, and that evening was clear and cold, with the half moon and good visibility up and down the street. I looked up from my book, and there was something in the street directly in front of my house. It was standing in the street, and it was large. I've already established that I am precise, and I want to be precise about what I saw. It was standing in the street at a height of approximately 9 feet. This is not a guess. I estimated the height against known reference points. The street light on the corner of my block is mounted at approximately 12 feet. The thing in my street was standing at roughly 3/4 of that height, which gives 9 feet as a reasonable estimate. I'm confident in this number within a foot in either direction. It was upright, bipedal. The posture was the posture of something that stands on 2 legs as its primary mode of locomotion, meaning it was fully erect, spine vertical, weight balanced on 2 lower limbs. The upper limbs were at its sides. The head was large relative to what I could estimate of the body below it. It was facing my house, facing my porch, facing me. I sat in my porch chair and I looked at it, and it stood in the street and faced the porch, and we were in this configuration for what I timed on my watch was 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I timed it because timing is what you do when you want accurate information, and I wanted accurate information. After 4 minutes and 20 seconds, it turned. Not away from me, to the right, which is north on my street, and it began to walk north. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. At 4 steps, it was in a pool of shadow between 2 streetlights, and I lost clear visual on it, and after another 3 or 4 seconds, I could not see it at all. I sat on the porch for another 15 minutes. The street was empty and quiet. I went inside and I wrote down what I had seen in the notes application on my phone. The time, the duration of the observation, the height estimate, and the reference points used to arrive at it. The directional movements, the general physical description. I have that note still. It is dated and time-stamped. I'm a retired mathematics teacher, and I'm 64 years old, and I sat on my own front porch in Philippi in West Virginia and watched something 9 feet tall stand in my street for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and then walk north and disappear between 2 streetlights. That is what happened. I have the note to confirm it. The note is accurate. I have not told anyone in Philippi about this. It is not the kind of information that improves a person's standing in a small community. And I spent 31 years building a standing in this community that I value. What I have done is continue to sit on the porch in the evenings when the weather permits, because the porch is where I read, and I am not going to give that up. And I have become attentive to the street in front of my house in a way that I was not before March 3 years ago. I have not seen it again. I'm aware that not seeing it again is not equivalent to its absence. I am aware that it was in my street for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and that I do not know what it was doing in my street, and I do not know what it will do if it comes back. These are the variables I cannot resolve. I have accepted them as unresolvable with the information I have, and I have moved forward. That is what you do with an unresolvable variable. You note it and you move forward and you remain attentive. I remain attentive. Story 4, I've been a pipe fitter for 28 years. I work in the industrial sector in Logan County, and I've worked on facilities throughout the southern coal fields, natural gas processing plants, chemical facilities, the industrial infrastructure of southern West Virginia that most people who live here know is there without knowing specifically what it does. The work is skilled and it is physical, and it requires close attention to conditions that will injure or kill you if you misread them. I have been reading conditions accurately for 28 years, and I'm still here, which I take as evidence that I'm good at it. My name is Sutton Blevins, and I'm 53 years old. I live in the town of Logan, and I want to tell you about something I found on a section of rural road outside of Logan about 4 years ago on a morning when I was driving to a job site in the pre-dawn dark. The road is a county road that cuts through the hill country east of Logan, winding through hollows and over ridges, connecting Logan to a series of smaller communities further east. I had been using it for about 2 years as my route to a particular job site. It added 5 minutes to the drive compared to the state road, but avoided a stretch of the state road that was under long-term construction. I knew the county road well. At 5:40 in the morning, the road was empty and dark, and my headlights were the only light in several miles of hollow and ridge. I was on a section of the road that ran along the bottom of a narrow hollow, creek on one side, wooded slope on the other, when my headlights picked up something on the road surface ahead of me. Large, dark. On the road surface itself, not on the shoulder. My first read was a downed tree or large debris from the slope above. I slowed, and as I got closer and my headlights gave me better resolution, I understood that what was on the road was not debris and was not a downed tree. It was an animal, or it was something that was built like an animal in the general sense that it was large and had 4 points of ground contact. But the configuration of those 4 points was wrong. The way it was positioned on the road surface was wrong for any animal I could name. It was flat in a way that was not the flatness of an injured animal or a dead animal. It was flat in the deliberate way that something is flat when it is chosen to be, pressing itself against the road surface actively. I stopped about 60 feet from it. My headlights were on it directly. It was approximately the length of my truck, which is a full-size pickup, and the width through the body was substantial. The road surface around it was visible in my headlights, and the thing on the road was darker than the road, and it was flat and it was not moving. I sat in the truck with the engine running, and I looked at it, and I ran through the animals that are present in Logan County, and I eliminated them. Bear is the largest animal in the county. A bear this size does not exist in Logan County. The proportions were wrong for a bear regardless of size. I eliminated everything I had a name for, and I was left with nothing, which is where I always end up with this, and which has not gotten easier in 4 years. After about 2 minutes, it moved. The movement was a slow gathering of its mass from the flat posture into something more compact, the way water gathers when a surface tilts. It pulled itself from flat to collected without any individual limb movement that I could identify. The mass simply rearranged itself from distributed to gathered, and then it was upright, or approximately upright, standing on the road surface, and it stepped off the road to the right, toward the creek, and went into the creek bank vegetation, and I heard nothing from the vegetation, and could see nothing in it. I drove to the job site. I was on time. I did not tell my crew what I had seen on the county road because my crew needed to trust my judgment all day in conditions that would injure them if my judgment was off, and telling them I had seen something on the road in the dark that I could not name was not going to help anyone. I kept it to myself. I took the state road home that evening, construction and all. I took the state road for 6 weeks. Then the job on the state roadside was done, and the commute became impractical, and I went back to the county road. I've driven the county road at 5:40 in the morning many times since. I've found the road empty and ordinary on every occasion since that morning. I look at the road surface carefully through the dark sections, and I have not found anything on the road surface that did not belong there. But I drive that hollow section with the awareness that has replaced whatever I used to feel in that section, which was nothing, which was the ordinary absence of awareness that an empty county road at 5:40 produces. The ordinary absence of awareness is gone. In its place is an active attention to the road surface in the dark. That attention is going to be there for the rest of the time I drive that road. It does not cost me anything practical. It just costs me the ordinary feeling that the road is simply a road. That feeling is gone. The road is not simply a road. I know that now, and I cannot unknow it. Story 5. I do alterations and sewing work out of my home in Elkins, in Randolph County. I've been doing it for 14 years, built up a steady client base from the community and from the towns surrounding Elkins, and I supplement it with quilt work and custom sewing that I sell through a few outlets in the area. My husband works for the railroad, and we have 2 teenagers, and the home business lets me be here when they get home from school. My name is Adele Burchett, and I'm 42 years old. And what I want to tell you is not dramatic in the way that some accounts are dramatic. It is quiet and it is specific, and it has been with me for 2 years, and I need it somewhere outside my own memory. My workroom is in the back of our house, a converted bedroom that I use for the sewing machines and the cutting table and the storage for materials. It has a window that looks out onto the backyard, which backs up to a wooded area that is part of a larger tract owned by a family that does not develop it. The trees come close to the back of the yard, and in summer the leaf canopy is dense enough to make the workroom feel enclosed. I like this. I work better with natural light filtered through leaves than I do in direct sun. 2 years ago in late August, I was at the cutting table near the window in the afternoon working on a quilt top. And I looked up from the fabric, and there was a face in the trees at the back of the yard. I want to be specific and accurate about this. There was a face in the trees at the back of the yard at a height that put it level with the upper branches of the trees, which are mature second growth, and put their lower canopy at 20 to 25 feet. The face was at that height, in the canopy, looking at the window. I could not make out the features clearly at that distance. What I could make out was the general configuration of a face, the arrangement of features that constitutes a face and the way that human faces are arranged, and the size of it, which was wrong, too large. The scale of the face relative to the leaves around it was wrong in the way that a face in a photograph is wrong when the scaling is off. I knew immediately that what I was looking at was too large for any face I had a reference for. I looked at it. It was in the canopy looking at my window. We were in that configuration for maybe 15 seconds, and then whatever the face belonged to moved further into the trees and the canopy closed, and there was nothing in the trees. I put down my rotary cutter and I stood at the cutting table for a while. Then I went to the kitchen and I made tea, and I stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard. The trees at the back were ordinary trees with ordinary canopy moving in the wind. Nothing in them. I went back to the workroom and I continued the quilt top. The quilt was due the following Friday, and I had a schedule to keep. This is relevant because what I did after seeing a face the size of a very large thing in the canopy of the trees behind my house was go back to work on a quilt. That is what you do. You go back to work. You maintain your schedule. You put it in the part of your mind that can hold something without resolving it, and you keep going. In the 2 years since, I have looked at those trees many times. From the workroom window and from the kitchen window, and from the backyard itself. I have not seen the face in the canopy again. I have sometimes had the sense that the trees at the back of the yard have a quality of occupied that is distinct from their usual empty quality. And on those days, I do not go into the backyard. I work at the cutting table, and I look at the trees with the peripheral awareness of someone who knows that trees can contain things at canopy height, that look at windows. I have not told my husband or my children. My children are teenagers, and teenagers do not need to know that there was a face in the trees at 25 feet looking at the house. My husband is a practical man who would want to do something about it, and there's nothing to be done about it, and I do not want him to do nothing about it in a worried way. So I carry it. I'm telling it here because carrying it alone for 2 years is a specific kind of weight, and this is a way of putting it down without putting it anywhere that does it harm. Whatever was in the canopy looked at my window and then went back into the trees. It left me alone, and I am leaving it alone, and whatever arrangement that constitutes has been working for 2 years. I intend to maintain it. Story 6. I have been calling livestock auctions in Pendleton County for 17 years. Before that, I worked at my uncle's farm in the county for 12 years, and before that, I grew up on a cattle farm outside of Franklin. I have been around livestock my entire life, and the work of livestock auctioning, which involves standing in a ring surrounded by animals and buyers for hours at a time, has given me a specific relationship with the behavior of animals that is deeper and more practical than most people develop. Animals communicate through behavior, and I have learned to read that communication over decades of close observation. A bull that is about to charge tells you it is about to charge through a specific sequence of behavioral signals if you know what to look for. A frightened cow has a body language that is specific and readable. I know what animal behavior looks like when the animal is responding to a real threat and what it looks like when it is responding to nothing. My name is Floyd Tackett, and I'm 55 years old, and what I want to tell you is about my own cattle on my own property in Pendleton County. On a series of nights 2 winters ago, when my herd behaved in a way that I have not been able to attribute to any identifiable cause. I run about 40 head of cattle on my property, a mix of beef breeds, good animals, a herd I have built over years, and that I know individually. I know their normal behavior thoroughly. What happened in January and February of 2 winters ago was not normal behavior, and it began on a Monday night in late January. I was awoken at about 1 a.m. by my cattle in the lower field making noise, not the usual lowing of cattle that have been disturbed by something minor. The specific vocalizations of cattle in a threat response. I know the difference, and the difference is significant. Cattle in a threat response make a sound that is different in pitch and in urgency, and in the way they coordinate the sound. Multiple animals calling in the same pattern, as if responding to the same thing from multiple positions. I got up and I put on my coat and boots, and I took my flashlight and I went to the lower field. The cattle were gathered in the center of the field, all of them, the full herd, in a tight cluster with the larger animals on the outside and the smaller animals and the calves in the interior. This is the specific defensive formation that cattle use when they have identified a predator. It is distinct from the loose grouping of cattle that are mildly alarmed, and it is distinct from the scattered behavior of cattle that are panicked. It is the organized defensive response of a herd that has located a threat and is responding to it collectively. I swept the field with my flashlight. Along the fence line at the far end of the lower field, I found what the herd was responding to, or rather, I found where it had been. The fence at the far end of the lower field had a large gate, a metal gate on hinges. And on the ground on the outside of the gate, there were marks in the frozen mud that I could not attribute to any animal I could name. Large, not hoofed, not pawed in any configuration I recognized. And the lower rail of the gate was bent, not broken, bent inward, as if something on the outside had pressed against it with substantial force. I checked the herd for injuries. All 40 head were present and uninjured. The defensive cluster began to break up as I moved through the field, which is the normal response when the farmer is present, because my presence tells them the situation is being managed. I spent about an hour in the field until the herd was grazing normally again, and then I went back to bed. This happened on 4 separate occasions over 6 weeks. Each time, the same sequence. The specific threat vocalization waking me at 1 or 2 in the morning. The herd and defensive formation in the center of the field. Evidence at the fence line of something large having been present outside the field. Never any animal visible when I arrived. Never any injury to the herd. I called the State Division of Natural Resources and described what I was observing and asked about predator activity in Pendleton County. They told me about black bear and coyote and suggested I look for tracks. I found marks at the fence line on several occasions that I photographed and sent to the DNR contact. The response I got was that the photographs were inconclusive and that the marks could be consistent with bear activity. I did not find this response satisfying, given my professional experience, reading animal behavior and animal sign, but I accepted it as the official position. The incident stopped in mid-February. The herd has been normal since. I have not heard the threat vocalization in the night since mid-February of 2 winters ago, and the fence at the far end of the lower field has not been pressed again. I do not know what spent 6 weeks coming to the fence line of my lower field at 1 or 2 in the morning and pressing against the gate with enough force to bend the lower rail. I know that 40 cattle recognized it as a serious predator threat on 4 separate occasions and organized themselves accordingly. Cattle do not organize in a coordinated defensive formation in response to nothing. 40 years of working with cattle has made me certain of that. Whatever came to my fence line was real and was large and was recognized by my herd as a genuine threat. It is not there now. I hope it stays not there. But I sleep lighter than I did before last winter, and I check the lower field fence line more often than I used to. And I know what the threat vocalization sounds like, and I am not going to sleep through it again. Story 7, I repair watches and clocks. Have been doing it for 32 years out of a small shop in Lewisburg in Greenbrier County. Before I started the shop, I apprenticed under a watchmaker in Charleston for 8 years, and before that I was a clockwork hobbyist from the age of 12 when my grandfather gave me his old pocket watch to take apart. The work requires patience and precision, and a tolerance for operating at a very small scale, and I am suited to all of these things. My name is Emmett Grice, and I am 60 years old, and I live above my shop in a 2-room apartment. I have lived above the shop for 22 years. The shop is on a corner in Lewisburg's historic downtown, ground floor of an 1870s building, and the apartment above it has windows on 2 sides, one facing the main street and one facing the side street. What I want to tell you about happened at the side street window. The side street that runs alongside my building is a short street, 1 block, connecting the main commercial street to a residential block. It is not heavily trafficked, and at night it is quiet. I have been looking out that window for 22 years, and it is an unremarkable view. The old brick wall of the building across the alley gap, a stretch of sidewalk, a section of the side street. About 3 years ago, I was at the workbench late, which I often am because the work requires concentration, and the late evening is when I have the most of it. I was at the bench at about 11 at night, and I looked up from a movement I was working on and looked at the side street window, which is habit, and there was something in the side street window. Not at the window, in the window. I mean that the window frame was full of it. The window is a standard double-hung window, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, and what was in the window filled the frame. It was close to the glass. Very close. On the other side of the glass at a distance of inches. I wanted to describe what I saw in the window frame with the precision that my work requires. A surface. A large, dark surface that was not wall and not glass and not anything that was there before. A surface that had a texture that I could see even in the limited light. A rough, uneven texture that was organic rather than material, in the sense that stone and brick and wood are material. And at the upper portion of the window frame, occupying the top third of the frame, 2 circular areas that were lighter than the surrounding surface and that were oriented toward me. Eyes. Or what occupied the position that eyes would occupy on a face. In the top third of my side street window. Looking at me through the glass. I was at the workbench with a movement open in front of me and a loop in my hand. And I looked at the window, and what was in the window looked at me, and I did not move. And it did not move. And we were in this configuration for what I believe was about 90 seconds. Then it was gone. The window was the window again. The alley gap and the brick wall of the building across it and the section of sidewalk, ordinary. As if nothing had been filling the frame. I put down the loop and I missed the workbench for a while. Then I went to the kitchen and I got a glass of water. And I sat at the kitchen table with it. I am a precise man, and I was precise about what I had seen, and what I was precise about was this. Whatever filled my side street window at 11 at night was large enough to fill a 3 by 5 foot window frame and was close enough to the glass that I could see the texture of its surface. And it had 2 circular areas in its upper portion that were lighter than the surrounding surface and were oriented toward me through the glass. I have thought about the logistics of what that requires. The building across the alley gap is separated from my building by approximately 8 feet. The thing that was in my window was on the outer side of my glass, which means it was in the air 8 feet above a sidewalk in a Lewisburg alley, filling a window frame with its surface while looking through the glass at a watchmaker on the other side. 8 feet above the sidewalk, filling a 3 by 5 window frame, looking at me. I have not seen it since. I still live above the shop, and I still work late at the bench, and I still look up at the side street window. I have added a heavier curtain to the side street window, the blackout kind, which I keep drawn after dark. Not because I'm afraid to see it again, or not only because of that, because there's something about the possibility of looking up from a delicate movement and finding the window filled with a surface that is looking at me through the glass that interferes with the concentration the work requires. The curtain is a practical solution to a practical problem. I keep it drawn. I continue the work. The work is precise, and it is mine, and it has been mine for 32 years. And nothing that fills my window at night is going to take it from me. I draw the curtain. I work. That is sufficient. Story 8. I spent 30 years doing underground survey work for a coal company in Wyoming County. Survey work in the mines is not glamorous, and it is not well understood. You go underground with instruments and you measure. You determine where the workings are relative to the surface, where they are relative to each other, what the geometry of the mine looks like in 3 dimensions. It is precise and it is essential, and when it is done well, the miners know exactly where they are, and when it is done badly, people die. I did it for 30 years, and I retired 6 years ago at 62. My name is Garnet Cook, and I'm 68 now, and I live in the Wyoming County community where I was born and where I have lived my whole life, except for some years in my 20s when I worked in the mines in Kentucky before coming home. What I want to tell you happened not underground, but above ground, in the community where I live, about 4 years ago. I was retired by that point, and I was going through a period of sleeping badly, which happens to people my age, and which I dealt with by getting up when I could not sleep and sitting in my kitchen or on the back porch rather than lying in bed fighting it. The back porch of my house looks out at the community. My house is on a slight rise, and from the back porch, you can see several of the neighboring houses and the road below and the hillside that rises on the far side of the road. It is a familiar view and one I had been looking at my whole life. At about 2 a.m. on a night in September 4 years ago, I was on the back porch in my chair with a cup of decaf, looking at the community in the moonlight. The moon was bright enough to see the road and the houses and the hillside clearly. I was looking at the hillside when I noticed something on it. On the hillside, moving along the hillside horizontally, from north to south, moving at a height on the hillside that put it well above the road below and well below the ridge above, moving through the trees on the slope, visible as a dark shape against the lighter hillside, where the moon lit the ground between the trees. I watched it move along the hillside. What was wrong about it, what made me lean forward in my chair and pay the specific kind of attention that 30 years of mine survey work trains you to pay to spatial relationships? was the height of it relative to the trees around it. I know those trees. They are second growth hardwood that I have been looking at from this porch my whole life, and I know their approximate heights. Whatever was moving along the hillside was too tall for the trees to conceal. It was taller than the canopy of those trees, moving through the trees taller than the trees, not through the canopy in the way a bird moves through a canopy. On the ground, moving along the slope, taller than the trees that surrounded it. I watched it move south along the hillside for about 2 minutes. It reached a point on the slope where the trees gave way to open rocky ground near a cut in the hillside where an old road had been graded. And at that open section it was fully visible in the moonlight, unobstructed by trees. And I could see it clearly for about 15 seconds before it moved back into the tree section on the far side of the cut. I'm not going to tell you that I know what I saw in those 15 seconds because I am a precise man and I do not claim certainty I do not have. What I'm going to tell you is what was there in that moonlit cut in the hillside moving south, above the road and below the ridge, in a community in Wyoming County, West Virginia. It was large. It was upright, fully upright on 2 legs. The stride length covered the width of the rocky cut in approximately 4 strides, which gives me a stride length that I have calculated at between 4 and 5 feet. The height I estimated against the cut bank of the old road grade, which I know to be approximately 10 feet, and the thing moving through the cut was taller than the cut bank. I sat on my back porch for the rest of the night. The hillside was quiet and empty after it passed through the cut and went back into the trees on the far side. In the morning, the hillside looked the way it always looked, and the road below it was ordinary, and the community was the community I had grown up in. I have sat on that porch many nights since, and I have watched that hillside. I've not seen it again. But I look at the hillside now with the trained spatial attention that 30 years of underground survey gave me, estimating heights and distances and proportions. And I know what I calculated in those 15 seconds in the moonlit cut. I know the stride length and I know the height, and I know that no animal I have a name for moves through Wyoming County hillsides at 2 in the morning at that height and that stride. I have accepted this knowledge the way I accepted difficult knowledge in the mines, by incorporating it into my understanding of the terrain and continuing to work with accurate information. This is accurate information. The terrain contains something I cannot name. I continue to sit on the porch. I watch the hillside. That is the accurate response. Story 9. I run a roadside vegetable stand in Gilmer County on a state road that gets decent traffic through the summer and early fall. It is a seasonal operation, runs from June through October, and I sell what I grow on my property, plus some additional produce from neighboring farms. I have been doing it for 11 years, and it is a good business in the specific way that simple, honest outdoor commerce is good. You grow things and people need things, and you meet in the middle of a state road, and both of you go away satisfied. My name is Winifred Prater, and I'm 58 years old, and the vegetable stand has a small storage building behind it, where I keep the additional stock and the supplies and the money box at the end of the day. The storage building is nothing special, 4 walls and a roof and a padlock on the door, but I'm in it several times a day during the season. About 3 summers ago, in July, I was in the storage building in the late afternoon just before I closed for the day, taking inventory of what I would need the following morning. It was around 5:30 and the light was still good and the storage building door was open. I was at the back of the building looking at my stock when the light in the doorway changed. Something was in the doorway. Something was in the doorway of my storage building. I turned around and looked at the doorway, and the doorway was full of a shape. The doorway is a standard door, 6'8" tall, about 3 feet wide, and what was in it filled the width of it and extended above the height of it, the top of the shape above the door frame. Whatever was in my storage building doorway was taller than 6'8" and wider than 3 feet, and I was at the back of the building about 12 feet from the door. I stood at the back of my storage building, and I looked at what was in the doorway, and I was trying to think of what to say or do, and I could not find anything to say or do because nothing in my experience had prepared me for this specific configuration of events. I run a vegetable stand. I deal with difficult customers and weather and deer in the garden, and the 1,000 ordinary challenges of a small agricultural business. I do not have a protocol for something in the doorway of my storage building that is taller than the door frame. It stood in the doorway for what felt like a long time. I could not see it clearly because the light was behind it, and the interior of the building where I was standing was dim, and what I was looking at was essentially a silhouette against the afternoon light. A silhouette that was wrong in the way that the wrong size and the wrong proportions of a silhouette are immediately legible, even when you cannot see the features. Then it stepped back. One step back from the door frame, and then it was no longer filling the door, and I could see the afternoon light beyond the door, and the storage building interior was my storage building interior again. I stood at the back for another minute. Then I walked to the door and I looked out. The area behind the vegetable stand was the area behind the vegetable stand, the rough grass and the tree line at the back of the property. Nothing visible. Nothing that accounted for what had been in my door. I closed the stand and I drove home and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the silhouette in the storage building doorway. The width, the height above the frame, the quality of its presence in the door, which had the quality of intention. It was in the doorway because it had chosen to be in the doorway, not because it was passing and happened to stop. It was standing in the doorway of my storage building because it had decided to stand there. I went back to the stand the following morning, and the stand was as I had left it, and the storage building was as I had locked it, and nothing was disturbed. And I ran the stand all day, and it was an ordinary day. I have run the stand for 2 more seasons since, and the storage building doorway has not been filled with a silhouette again. But I keep the storage building open when I am in it, and I do not turn my back to the door for long. That is the only change I have made. You keep the door open so you can see if something is in it. You do not turn your back to the door. Simple adjustments. They cost nothing, and I maintain them without difficulty. The stand is still good business. The produce is still good. I still meet people on the state road, and both of us go away satisfied. The summer is still mine. The storage building is still mine. Whatever stood in the doorway that July afternoon has not stood there since. I intend to maintain conditions under which it continues not to stand there. That is my complete plan, and I find it sufficient. Storytime I bake. Have done it my whole adult life, and have been selling my baked goods out of my home in Elkins in Randolph County for going on 9 years. Bread, pies, cakes, specialty items for events and celebrations. I have a commercial license and a good reputation in the county and a customer base that has grown steadily since I started. I do most of my production baking in the early morning hours, starting at 4, because the bread requires time and the oven needs to be managed carefully, and I like working when the house is quiet. My name is Hattie Duran, and I am 49 years old, and what I want to tell you happened in my kitchen on a specific morning in November 2 years ago, when I was at the kitchen counter at 4:30 doing prep work, and I became aware that something was outside my kitchen window. The kitchen window faces the backyard, and the backyard is fenced, and beyond the fence is a community garden that several neighbors share. The community garden has been there for years, and I am one of the gardeners in it, and I know its layout in detail. At 4:30 in the morning in November, the window shows me the backyard and the fence and the dark shape of the garden beyond. What I became aware of was that the garden was not empty in the way that the garden is always empty at 4:30 in the morning. There was something in it. Not a sound at first. A quality of the darkness beyond the fence that was different from empty darkness. I have baked at 4:30 in the morning for 9 years, and I know what the empty garden looks like in the dark. And the garden did not look the way it looked when it was empty. I kept doing my prep. I was working on a dough that required attention, and I kept working, and I kept being aware of the garden. And then I heard something from the garden, a sound that I am going to describe as specific rather than dramatic, because it was specific and it was not dramatic. It was the sound of the garden being attended to. The sound of something moving through the garden rose the way I move through the garden rows when I'm tending it. Careful, close to the ground movement through planted rows. Not destroying, not eating, not digging. Attending. At 4:30 in the morning in November, the community garden has nothing in it. The season is over. The plants are cleared, the beds are put to rest for winter. There's nothing in the garden rows to attend to, but whatever was in the garden was moving through the rows as if there were. I went to the window and I looked at the garden. The darkness was too complete for me to see into it clearly. I thought about turning on the back porch light, which would illuminate the garden, and I decided against it. The decision was instinctive and immediate, and I did not deliberate about it. I just did not turn on the light. The sound from the garden continued for about 20 minutes. Movement through the rows, careful and systematic, moving from one end of the garden to the other and back. Then it stopped. I went back to my dough. What I have thought about in the 2 years since is the nature of what it was doing. Attending to the rows, moving through them carefully the way a gardener moves through them. In November, in a garden that has been put to rest for winter. Whatever was in the community garden at 4:30 on a November morning was familiar with what a garden is and what you do in one. It was moving through those rows the way I moved through them, and the season and the hour did not alter the character of what it was doing. It was tending a garden that was not being tended by anyone else at that hour and at that time of year. I have not heard it in the garden again. I have been at the kitchen counter at 4:30 in the morning for 2 years since, and the garden has been empty in the ordinary way, and I have made my bread and managed my oven and done my work. But in April, when I started the new garden season, and I went into the community garden to turn my beds and prepare for planting, I found that the soil in my section of the garden had already been worked. Turned and aerated, I had not done it. The other gardeners had not done it. Their sections were untouched. My section had been worked. I worked it again, more carefully, the way I wanted it, and I planted my seeds, and I did not mention it to the other gardeners. I do not know if what attended the empty garden in November is the same thing that turned my beds before I could get to them in spring. I do not know if it was a gift or something else or neither. I know that my beds were turned and that I had not turned them and that nobody else in the community garden had touched them. I accepted the turn beds and I planted my seeds and I had a good garden season and I baked what the garden produced and my customers were happy. That is the complete account. I find no frame that satisfactorily contains it. I have given up looking for one, and I have simply included it in the ongoing account of what my life consists of, which now includes a November night when something attended my empty garden rows and a spring morning when my beds had been turned by nobody I could name. Story 11. I do stone masonry work. Have for 26 years. Stone walls, foundations, chimneys, fireplaces, steps, the traditional construction methods that this part of West Virginia has used for as long as there have been buildings here. The work is physical and skilled, and the material is permanent in a way that most construction materials are not. A stone wall I build today will be here in 100 years. I take that seriously. My name is Obadiah Watts, and I am 54 years old, and I work throughout Pocahontas County and the surrounding counties. I have worked on properties all over this region, and I know the backcountry of Pocahontas County in the specific way that a tradesman who has worked throughout it for 26 years knows it by its individual properties and the specific character of each. What I want to tell you about happened on a property in the hill country of Pocahontas County about 5 years ago. A job I was doing alone, repairing the foundation of an old farmhouse that had been in a family for multiple generations and was being restored by the current generation. The property was remote. The access road was rough, and the nearest neighbor was several miles away. I was driving out to the property each day for 2 weeks. On the 8th day of the job, I was working on the north foundation wall of the house, which required me to clear soil and vegetation away from the base of the wall to assess the damage and make the repair. The clearing work took most of the morning and exposed the original foundation stone, which was laid in the 1890s by whoever built the house. Good work. Square corners, careful coursing, the kind of masonry that I respect regardless of its age. At the base of the wall, when I had cleared down to the original grade, I found something that I'm going to describe with the specificity it deserves. Pressed into the soil at the base of the north foundation wall, at a spacing of about every 4 feet along the full length of the wall, there were hand impressions, not human hand impressions. The size was wrong, and the proportions were wrong, and the depth was wrong. These were large, much larger than any human hand I have encountered in 26 years of handling stone with my own hands. The fingers were longer than they should have been relative to the palm. The depth of the impressions in the soil was greater than a hand pressed against soil would produce, suggesting they were made with force or with a weight that exceeded a normal hand. There were 11 of them along the full length of the north wall, spaced at regular intervals, all oriented the same way, fingers pointing toward the foundation stone, like something had pressed its hands against the base of the foundation along the full length of the north wall. I documented them. I photographed every one, and I measured them. I have the photographs still. I finished the clearing, and I assessed the wall damage, and I began the repair. And I did not mention the hand impressions to the property owners when they visited the site the following day. I mentioned the quality of the original foundation work, which was genuinely impressive. I did not mention the 11 large hand impressions pressed into the soil at the base of it. I finished the job on time and within budget, and the foundation repair is good work that will last. On the last day I was at the property, filling in the soil I'd cleared back to grade, I covered the 11 impressions. I did not feel anything specific about covering them. I just noticed that I was covering them, and that after I covered them, they would not be accessible without digging them out again, and that the only people who knew they were there were me and whatever had put them there. I drove home and I put my equipment away, and I did not think about the job any differently than I think about any other job. The work was done and the work was good. But I have thought about the hand impressions many times since, and what I come back to is the placement of them. At the base of the foundation wall, along the full length of the north wall, fingers pointing toward the stone. Something had been pressing its hands against the base of that foundation for long enough to leave deep impressions in the soil at regular intervals along its full length. The house was 1890s construction. I do not know how long it had been pressing. I do not know what pressing its hands against the foundation accomplished for whatever did it. I know that the impressions were deep, and that the spacing was regular, and that there were 11 of them along the full length of the north wall, and that they were made by something with hands that were not human hands. The foundation repair is solid. The house will stand for another 100 years if it is maintained. Whatever pressed its hands against the north wall did not damage the foundation. That is the practical outcome, and I acknowledge it. The practical outcome is fine. What I cannot file neatly is what was pressing and why, and whether it is still doing so now that I have repaired the wall and covered the impressions and driven away. I do not go back to that property. The job is done, and there is no reason to go back. But I think about the north wall occasionally, and I am glad the repair is solid, and I am glad I do not know what was pressing against it. Story 12. I spent 35 years working as a telephone lineman for the phone company in Webster County and the surrounding area. I retired 7 years ago. The work took me up poles and into the terrain throughout the county, in every kind of weather and at every hour, because line work does not stop for weather and does not stop for dark. When a line goes down, you go fix it. That is the job. My name is Dillard Estep, and I am 66 years old, and I live outside of Webster Springs, where I have lived my whole life. Webster County is one of the smaller counties in West Virginia, and it is remote in a specific way, surrounded by ridges and with limited state road access. The kind of county where people from other parts of the state sometimes express surprise that the county exists at all. I find this amusing. The county exists and has always existed, and it is a good county. I am glad I spent my life in it. What I want to tell you happened about 12 years ago when I was still working. On a winter night when a line was down in a rural section of the county in the hill country above a small community. It was February and the temperature was in the 20s, and the access was through about 1.5 miles of unpaved road that had iced in the previous night's temperature drop. I drove the company truck as far as the road was passable and walked the rest with my equipment. The line was down at a pole near the top of the hill, above the last property on the road, in a section that was uninhabited above it. A connection issue at the junction box, not a difficult repair, but requiring work at height in the cold, with gloves on, which adds time. I climbed the pole and I opened the box and I did the repair in about 25 minutes. Standard work. I've done the same repair 100 times while I was at the top of the pole, which put me at about 30 feet. I heard something from the ridge above me. The ridge was dark, no moon that night, and the ridge was maybe 200 feet above the road where the pole was. From the ridge, I heard a sound that I want to describe carefully because the description matters. It was a long, low sound, sustained. Not a howl in the way coyotes howl, not a vocalization I associated with any animal I'd encountered in 35 years of working in the outdoors of Webster County. It had a tonal quality that suggested it was being produced deliberately, with control, the way a sound is produced by something that knows how to make sound and is making this one intentionally. And then from further along the ridge, maybe a 1/4 mile east, the same sound, the same tonal quality, the same sustained duration, an answer. 2 of them on the ridge above me in February at 10 at night. I finished the repair, I closed the junction box, I climbed down the pole. I walked back down the iced road to the truck and I drove to the next job and then I drove home. I want to tell you why I am including this account in particular, because 2 sounds from a ridge at night could have an ordinary explanation, and I acknowledge that. What I want to tell you is what I heard on the walk back down the iced road to the truck. One of them came down from the ridge. I did not see it. The night was too dark. But I heard it come down the ridge, through the timber on the slope, and the sound of it coming through the timber was not the sound of any animal I'd heard come through timber in 35 years of outdoor work in Webster County. It was too fast and too large and too quiet. Fast for the terrain and large for the sound and too quiet for either. Something of sufficient size to make the sounds I had heard on the ridge should not have been able to come down an iced wooded slope at that speed and at that level of quiet. But it did. It came down the ridge and reached the road about 50 yards behind me, which I estimated from the sound of it reaching the road surface, and then it stopped. I heard it stop. I did not stop. I continued to the truck at the same pace I had been walking, which was the pace of a man walking on an iced road with equipment in the dark, which is careful. I did not run. Running on iced road with equipment in the dark will put you on the ground, and I needed to get to the truck. I got to the truck. I loaded the equipment. I got in. I drove. I have thought about the 50 yards between where it reached the road and where I was when it reached the road. 50 yards behind me. And then it stopped. It came down the ridge and reached the road 50 yards behind me. And it stopped and I got to the truck and I drove away. I do not know what the 50 yards meant. Whether it was the distance at which it assessed me as not worth pursuing, or the distance it maintained as a courtesy, or some other calculation, I do not have the information to make. What I know is that it stopped at 50 yards, and I reached the truck and I drove away, and I have been home for 12 years since, and nothing has followed me home from that iced road in February. I am glad for the 50 yards. Whatever they represented, I am glad for them. Story 13. I have run the same diner in Mercer County for 22 years. It is on a state road at the edge of a small community, and it serves the working people of that community and the surrounding area. Breakfast and lunch only. Good food, reasonable prices, fast service. The diner is what it has always been, and I intend to keep it that way. My name is Bua Farrell, and I'm 61 years old, and I have been in this diner 6 days a week for 22 years, and I know this community and the people in it. The way you know a community when you have been feeding it for 2 decades. I know who is in what mood before they sit down. I know what they are going to order before they open their mouths. I know this stretch of State Road at every hour, because I open at 5:30 and I close at 2, and I am here for the full 9 hours, and sometimes longer. What I want to tell you about is the stretch of State Road that runs in front of the diner. The parking lot is on the road side of the building, and from the windows and the front door, I have a view of the State Road and the properties across from it, which are a mix of old residences and a former garage that has been vacant for years. About 4 years ago, in late November, I was closing the diner alone, which is normal. My last employee leaves at 1 and I do the final cleanup in the books, and I lock up around 2:15. It was 2:15 and I was at the front door about to lock it from the inside when I looked out the door glass at the State Road. Something was crossing the road. It was crossing from the residential side to the diner side, from the direction of the old houses across the road toward the diner parking lot. And it was crossing the road at a diagonal unhurried, and it was large, and it was wrong. I have been running this diner for 22 years, and I have seen everything that moves on this stretch of State Road at every hour. And nothing I have seen has prepared me for what was crossing the road at 2:15 in the morning on a November night. I could see it clearly enough. The parking lot lights were on, and the State Road has overhead lighting at intervals, and the thing crossing the road was in the light. The height of it was the first thing. Too tall. Moving across the road on 2 legs, fully upright, at a height that was wrong for anything that moves on 2 legs through Mercer County. The gait was the second thing. Long, slow, deliberate strides that covered the road width in a small number of steps. The kind of strides that belong to something whose legs are very long relative to the distance it is covering. It crossed the road and entered the diner parking lot. I was at the front door of my own diner, and something was in the parking lot. I stood at the door and I did not unlock it. I stood at the inside of the locked front door and I looked through the glass at the parking lot. It was in the parking lot, moving through the parking lot toward the diner, moving toward the front of the building where I was standing, moving toward the door I was standing at. I moved back from the door. I went to the kitchen. I turned off the front lights. I stood in the dark kitchen and I listened. From outside the front of the building, I heard it. Not a knock, not a voice. The sound of something at the front of the building that was present in the way that something large is present when it is close to a structure. A quality of the air in the building that changed when something of substantial size was close to the outside wall, like the building becoming aware of it. This lasted for about 3 minutes. 3 minutes of something at the front of my diner. Then, it was gone. The quality of the air changed back. I stood in the dark kitchen for another few minutes, and then I turned on the lights, and I locked the front door, and I went home through the back. I've been opening and closing this diner for 4 years, since that November night, and I have locked the front door and looked through the glass at the parking lot and the State Road every single closing since. I have not seen it cross the road again. I have not heard the quality of the air in the building change again. I run a good diner and I serve a good community, and I have been doing it for 22 years, and I'm going to do it for as many more as I'm able. Whatever crossed the State Road and came into my parking lot and stood at the front of my building on a November night 4 years ago has not come back. The diner is here. The food is good. The community is fed. If it comes back, I will go to the kitchen and I will turn off the front lights and I will wait. That is my complete protocol, and I developed it in 3 minutes in November, and I find it adequate. You run your business. You keep your lights on. When something comes into the parking lot that has no business being in a parking lot, you go to the kitchen and you turn off the lights and you wait. And then you go home and you come back at 5:30 and you open the diner and you feed the people who need to be fed. That is what you do. That is all you can do. I have been doing it for 22 years, and I will keep doing it, and whatever uses the state road at 2:15 in the morning in November is going to have to accommodate itself to the fact that the diner is here and is not going anywhere. The diner is not going anywhere. 13 accounts from 13 West Virginians who have been carrying these things for years and who needed somewhere to put them. If you made it to the end of this video, we need you to do 3 things right now. Like this video because it helps more people find these accounts, and these accounts deserve to be heard. Leave a comment telling us which story stayed with you and why, because the comments on this channel are where the community lives, and we read everyone. And subscribe to Park Ranger Files and hit the notification bell so you are here when the next batch drops. What is coming in the backlog is some of the most genuinely unsettling material this channel has ever published, and we do not want you to miss it. Every submission that comes to this channel is read personally. If something happened to you in West Virginia or anywhere else in these mountains that you have not been able to explain, the submission link is in the description. Tell it plainly. Tell it the way it happened. You do not have to know what it was. We will handle the rest. Thank you for being here.